Hi everyone, it's good to see you all. Most of you I don't know, who I do. So my name is Kevin Young, I teach in the history department at UMass Amherst. And I'm going to do something which historians don't usually do and which I don't usually do. And it's sort of inspired by talks that I've heard by Latin American intellectuals. I associate this tradition with Latin American intellectuals in particular, and I don't know why. So I'm going to present a series of theses about empire, grand general pronouncements about empire and its history, the patterns and characteristics that empires typically follow. Right? So these are going to be generalizations. And then we can think about the extent to which Israel and the United States today do or do not fit into these generalizations that I'm going to present. So I'm trying to identify some of the unifying characteristics in the history of empire. Not necessarily universal characteristics, because there is a lot of variation. A settler colonial state is different from other forms of empire. So that's one of the starting premises, I think, for today, is that there are multiple different modes of empire. Settler colonial project is different from other forms of empire, such as plantation economies that were set up in the Caribbean by European powers like France and Haiti, or England and Barbados and Jamaica. Right? And it's different from other forms of informal empire, which is the more common form of empire today. Informal meaning that there is no direct territorial annexation going on, but there is domination exerted over a foreign territory through other mechanisms. So, in terms of a baseline definition, we could say that empire involves the domination and subordination of a foreign territory in a project led by a state. Now, there's other ways to define empire or imperial control, imperial power, but I'm going to center the role of the state in carrying out the imperial project. And domination over a foreign territory could involve formal and informal mechanisms. It could involve military means and non-military means. There's a whole scope of different modes or forms that this can take. All right, so I'm going to delve into my 12 theses and try to go through these quickly. Don't tell any of my colleagues in the history department that I'm doing this, because they'll probably look down on me for doing this. I'm not, nuanced historians are not supposed to do this. So I've written on the board a few of the authors that I'm going to reference. All of the ideas that I'm presenting are original, or at least I'll say that most of the arguments I'm going to be making are things that other people have also said. I'm putting my own personal spin on much of it, but I'm going to refer throughout to some of the different books and articles that I'm taking my information and inspiration from. And some of their last names might be hard to spell, so that's why I've written up there, in case you want to follow up for yourself. Okay, so number one, imperialism is not an archaic or atavistic phenomenon. And even in its most direct colonial form, it persists in the present. So yes, imperialism is not simply a pre-modern or atavistic or archaic phenomenon. It's not something associated with old forms of empire like the Aztecs or the Incas or the Spanish Empire in the Americas. It is a thoroughly modern phenomenon as well. Many of the classic analyses of modern imperialism, which date from the late 1800s onward, people like Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin in Russia, John Hobson, actually before Lenin, in England, and the industrialists themselves in Britain and in the United States were saying essentially the same thing that Hobson and Lenin and Luxemburg were saying, which was that the growth of industrial capitalism in Britain and the US necessitated overseas expansion. It necessitated the quest for new markets because there was a crisis of what they called overproduction and underconsumption in the rich countries. The working class wasn't making enough money to consume all the products that it was making, so capitalists needed to look to overseas territories for new markets and new sources of raw materials for the manufactured goods that they were producing. So if you look back to the late 1800s and early 1900s, we see a series of deep economic crises in both Britain and the US. From 1873 until about 1896, there's a series of really severe depressions that were eclipsed only by the scale of the Great Depression of the 1930s. So the diagnosis of these economic problems was that it was a problem of overproduction and capital needed to look for overseas markets. So the growth of industrial capitalism is deeply intertwined with the growth of overseas empire starting in the late 19th century. So that's one of the connections to modern capitalism. Secondly, thesis number 2, societies may or may not be relatively democratic at home, even as they perpetrate monstrous crimes against foreign peoples. Britain in the 19th century was in a process of democratization. It was gradually including, as a result of working class agitation, including more and more sectors of society in franchise and in other sorts of political participation. So Britain was becoming at least more democratic over the scope of the 19th century. At the same time that it was perpetrating horrendous crimes in its overseas territories, in places like India, which I'll say a little bit more about. Similarly, the United States. In the 20th century, the United States was one of the world's more democratic countries. Right? I say more democratic, obviously it was not full democracy, it is not today a full democracy, but relative to many other countries, relatively democratic, domestically speaking, and yet, just like with the British Empire, the US Empire was responsible for millions upon millions of deaths overseas. Third, imperial domination is almost invariably accompanied by self-praise among imperial elites and most of the intellectual class in the imperial court. So, we hear a lot of talk about US exceptionalism, this idea that the United States is exceptional, it doesn't actually engage in empire, or if it does so for benevolent reasons. We see the same discourse in Israel today. Israel, even as it is perpetrating a literal genocide in Gaza, never ceases to tout its commitment to the welfare of the Palestinians. So they say, this phrase, the world's most moral military, right? And similar phrases that you hear repeated ad nauseum. This extreme form of gaslighting of the victim. Even as we are bombing you systematically, wiping out entire families, we are the world's most moral military. We don't intentionally bomb civilians the way Hamas does. So this is a transparently cynical discourse, whether it's coming from Israel or the United States. But the point I want to make here is that neither the US or Israel is exceptional in this regard. US exceptionalism and Israeli exceptionalism are not exceptional. Virtually all empires engage in this kind of gaslighting of their people and their victims. This imperial discourse and this self-praising discourse are of course accompanied by persistent dehumanization and denigration of the targeted society. Because the counterpart of our superiority is of course their inferiority. And this is something also common to virtually all empires. So the consistent denigration of Palestinians, of course, is not a surprise to anyone here. And it takes particular forms. One of the forms it takes is the notion that Palestinians have consistently rejected peace with Israel. This trope of Palestinian rejectionism is something that has gone on for decades, and it persists today. Right? The Palestinians were offered peace, and they rejected it. And they rejected it because they're irrational, and they have this kind of primordial hatred of Jews. That's one of the forms that this racist discourse takes in the case of Israel and Palestine. Often, the imperial ideology involves kind of paternalism, a paternalistic rhetoric about the well-being of the subject population. So if you look at U.S. empire or British empire before that, right at the time that the United States was expanding its overseas empire, in right at the end of the 19th century, this is the same time that the phrase "the white man's burden" was coined by Rudyard Kipling in the UK. So, the white man's burden, of course, referring to the way that the empire is carried out in the interest of the peoples who are being subordinated and dominated and killed. Because the empire is uplifting those people, civilizing them, and so on. So this is a common element in imperial rhetoric as well. In the case of Israel, we might debate the extent to which that is actually present. Right? My sense is that there's less of that paternalism in the Israeli case because the emphasis is more on expelling, wiping out, eliminating the native population. There's less emphasis on paternalism. 4, successful imperial domination relies on a class of native collaborators. You need local collaboration if you're going to carry out successful domination of a foreign territory. Lots of examples we can give of that. We can talk about whether and how that's true in the case of Palestine. I won't go into detail about that right now. 5, in cases where the victimized population is widely antagonistic to the foreign empire, imperialists will resort to collective punishment in response to resistance to their power, whether that resistance is violent or nonviolent. So we see collective punishment of subject populations through both military and non-military means. So when the British began colonizing North America, displacing and murdering indigenous populations, this was one of the major modes of responding to any kind of indigenous resistance. It was to lay siege upon indigenous villages, wipe out the crops, burn the houses, impose total devastation on the society as a form of collective punishment. And it was usually done through military means. It also took the form of denying food. Right? We see that, of course, today. The use of starvation as a means of warfare in Gaza. The first book on the list here, John Grenier, The First Way of War. Has anybody read that or heard of it? So this is about the history of the development of siege warfare, in particularly in the context of early British colonization of the eastern present-day United States. So this is collective punishment. It's a very deep history, goes back actually far earlier than that. If you look to ancient warfare and the way that militaries would lay siege to cities as a way of starving the population, right? Targeting the population as a way of undermining the state or the government of the people you're trying to conquer. It's not necessarily military. That military is not the only means of enforcing this collective punishment. So Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth actually refers to this when he talks about the aftermath of independence in formerly colonized countries. the way that they're subjected to economic warfare and isolation and blockades and embargoes as effectively as retaliation for their temerity in challenging empire, overthrowing empire. They're then subjected to forms of economic warfare. So we see this in the case of Cuba after 1959. Cuba is still being subjected to a relentless economic blockade. It hasn't taken the form of direct US military intervention. And the military aspect, there was a very real component which involved the use of military force, the US sponsoring terrorist forces to go to Cuba and invade, like at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. But that was just one instance in a very systematic and long-standing campaign throughout the 1960s and 70s and actually beyond to undermine the Cuban economy. Economic sabotage, it involved killing hundreds of Cubans, and that's another instance of collective punishment that combined both physical violence and economic violence. Another instance of this that we see is the use of collective punishment in response to nonviolent resistance is in the case of the first Intifada between 1987 and 1993. So when Palestinians engaged in nonviolent resistance to the Israeli occupation, they boycotted Israeli goods, they formed independent councils that could supplant the role of the existing government apparatus. And they did a lot of other really interesting and inspiring things during that first Intifada, which is largely forgotten today, certainly in the West, it's forgotten. There's a really good documentary about this, and I wrote it up there, but it came out, I think, in 2017. It's called Naila and the Uprising. Has everybody seen that? So I'll write it on the board in a minute. So it's a really inspiring documentary focused on the years of the first Intifada through the eyes of one Palestinian woman, Naila, who was a member of a leftist political organization called the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And in response to that nonviolent collective resistance, Israel imposed collective punishment just as it always has. There's quotations, you can see Yitzhak Rabin, other Israeli officials, in the late 80s, early 90s, saying, as long as Palestinians continue to resist, we are going to make them suffer. They say it in very clear terms. So I'll write that on the board in a second. It's definitely worth checking out. I think it's available on YouTube. 6, so I'm almost halfway through. The impacts of imperialism are not limited to the death and suffering that are directly and immediately imposed by the imperialists. They also include far-reaching or knock-on effects that distort the victimized society and ultimately harm the imperial society itself. So there's a lot there. Part of this is what's sometimes called the boomerang effect or blowback. In the case of 9/11 in the United States, the phrase blowback had a lot of currency, at least on the left. Right? People trying to assess why these terrorists would want to attack the United States on 9/11. And people who were being honest pointed to, some of the many legitimate grievances that people in the Middle East in particular have with US empire. Now, obviously that is not to excuse the use of terrorism, but the anger which gave rise to that terrorism was unquestionably rooted in US imperial intervention in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, in Israel, Palestine, and elsewhere. So this is an instance in which imperial violence ultimately comes back to harm the imperial society itself. And we can see this in the case of Israel as well. Israeli society, as many on the left have long argued, Israeli society itself is endangered by Israeli expansionism and violence. I'll come back to that point. The Martinican philosopher and poet Aimé Césaire, who wrote the famous essay Discourse on Colonialism, which I definitely recommend you read. This was, I think he wrote it in the 1950s originally, from Martinique, island in the Caribbean. And he has this phrase early in his essay. He says, colonization works to decivilize the colonizer. So part of what he was analyzing was the impact of imperialism on the imperial society itself, the way that it cultivates racism and hatred and other horrible attitudes and behaviors in the imperial population itself, right? And if a society is engaged in this vicious overseas imperialism, in order to justify their actions, they have to develop this kind of ideological apparatus, right? To even be able to sleep at night, to be able to think of themselves as good people. So we see this today, of course, in the US. We see it in Israel as well. The knock-on effects of imperialism also include the distortion of politics and society in the subject population itself. So here what I'm thinking about is for example, the suppression of secular nationalist and leftist resistance in places like Gaza and the West Bank. Before that, we could talk about a case like Iran. Iran in the early 1950s was governed by a secular nationalist government. Overthrown in 1953 with heavy participation from the United States. And the United States reinstalled the Shah in Iran, who was in power in 1979, overthrown in the Iranian Revolution. Iran is a microcosm of US policy in the Middle East in the mid to late 20th century. The general thrust of US policy was to promote Islamist forms of government, dictatorial forms of government, because the US feared the emergence of secular nationalist and leftist political projects. Like Mossadegh in Iran in the early 50s, like Nasser in Egypt in the 50s and 60s. We could also talk about this in reference to Palestine, the way that any sort of secular nationalist or leftist resistance, including the nonviolent resistance of the First Intifada, was systematically suppressed, rendered unviable, and that's goes a large part of the way toward explaining the rise of Hamas, because the other existing political forces have proven incapable of resisting Israeli expansionism. Fatah has proved utterly incapable of countering Israeli aggression, and therefore many people turn to Hamas as a potential alternative. And the tactics that that new resistance deploys, in turn, tend to feed the imperial ideology itself. Because in Israel, they point to Hamas. Hamas does attack civilians. It has attacked civilians. That's unquestionable. And that becomes evidence of inhumanity, savagery of the subject population. So it in turn reinforces the imperial ideology itself. Number 7, imperial elites who feel threatened tend to be even more extreme in their behavior, imposing harm and intensifying the problems that they themselves have created. So empires in their periods of decline, and the US has been in a period of relative decline for decades now, still, at the top of the world militarily and economically, but it has been in decline relative to the emergence of other economic competitors. Basically since World War II, or soon after World War II, the US has been struggling to hold on to its global economic hegemony. during these periods of decline, we can look at other examples too, like Britain in the late 19th century, during its period of decline. Empires tend to become more vicious, more destructive, and more reckless, intensifying the problems that they themselves have created. And sometimes this tendency is intensified still further by the domestic political battles of the leaders in question. So look at Netanyahu. It's obvious by this point that one of Netanyahu's major motivations is continuing the war because he fears for his own political future. So in these circumstances, empires are supremely dangerous. Number 8, the lethality of empire, how many people empire kills, is often not evident based solely on the mode or the outward appearance of imperial rule. So what I mean by that is the way that informal forms of empire can often kill even more people than the direct overt manifestations of empire do. So if we look at the economic policies forced upon the global south over the last century, those are actually going back further back in time than that. I'll give one example. Those economic policies are often responsible for most of the death and the suffering that results from empire. Right? But they slip a little bit more under the radar because they don't necessarily involve overt murder of people or bombing. One example, or a series of examples, comes from Mike Davis's book, Late Victorian Holocaust, which I definitely recommend. It's one of the most striking books I've ever read. And what he's talking about there is the way that empire and capitalism fundamentally shaped the impact of famines in the late 19th century. Famines are never, or almost never, just a natural phenomenon. Crop failures and droughts, yes, they occur in cycles naturally. Obviously, they're greatly intensified by carbon emissions now. But the way that societies respond to those phenomena is fundamentally shaped by considerations of power, capital, and empire. So Mike Davis, in his book, deals with 3 examples. He looks at China, India, and Brazil. In the last quarter of the 19th century, all of those societies faced devastating famines. But the reason why so many people died from those famines had everything to do with imperial control, direct or indirect, and the emergence of the capitalist market economy. So much of the death that happens through empire happens through market mechanisms. So if you look at the case of India, millions upon millions of people killed through these famines in the late 1800s. And onward, if we look at the Bengal famine of 1943, think about 3 million people died in that. Full knowledge of Winston Churchill and the way that British policy was contributing to that famine. Economic policies of heavy taxation, dispossession of peasant farmers, which undermines their ability to produce food, and the enforcement of a market economy, which had the effect of raising prices for grain and other food staples, and incentivized export of those grains, like rice, in the case of India, to overseas markets rather than to the famine-stricken parts of India that needed them so badly. Another example, if we go back further in time, is Ireland in the 1840s, the Great Famine there. It wasn't a question of the absolute shortage of food, it was about the distribution of food and the way that the grain was being exported based on the market demand in other overseas territories in England. If we come forward into the, and I'll just mention one shocking point from the Davis book. If we look at just India, China, and Brazil in the late 1800s, the estimate of people killed is between 32 and 61 million people who who died as a result of those famines, or more precisely because of the way that the government and capital responded to food shortages. So that is a colossal crime of empire, and one that is largely forgotten today, at least in this country, at least in Britain and the United States and the West in general. If we look today at other manifestations of empire, which are not necessarily overt, they are just as lethal as the British Empire in the late 1800s was. So think about the climate emergency. Climate emergency isn't always identified as part of empire, but when the powerful countries in the world have contributed the vast majority of carbon pollution since the dawn of the industrial age, that means massive death and suffering for people all around the world, on a scale that even surpasses the famines that I just spoke about in the late 1800s, or it will surpass. The scale of mortality resulting from carbon pollution is going to surpass, by all projections that I've seen, is going to far surpass those 32 to 61 million people killed in the late 1800s. Right? Nuclear weapons, another manifestation of imperialism. You know, I'm not sure I need to go into detail about this, but literally has in both the case of the climate emergency and nuclear arms, the powerful states in the world literally have the ability to make the planet unlivable. Or, in fact, in the case of nukes, kill most human beings on the planet. All right. 9, and I'll speed up a little bit here. Actually, maybe I'll skip over that point about sub-imperialism. So there's a Brazilian scholar writing in the mid-20th century, Juan Mauro Marini, who, I forgot the title of the book, but he's writing about the phenomenon of sub-imperialism. I think this is a concept that could be helpful for analyzing Israel. And he's Brazilian, he was Brazilian, and he was writing in reference to Brazil after the 1964 military coup. And he was analyzing the way that the Brazilian military dictatorship became what he called a sub-imperial power in its own right. It was allied to the United States, but it was also a minor imperial power in its own right with regard to the surrounding countries. And I think that this idea could be helpful for thinking about Israel as well. Israel is certainly a junior partner of the United States, but is also an imperial power in its own right. 10. Domestic ethnic groups can be influential in shaping imperial policy, but usually they only have influence when their goals align with larger imperial interests. So here I'm thinking of two domestic constituencies. First is Cuban Americans in the United States. We're often blamed, singularly blamed, for the policy of U.S. aggression against Cuba. And they are influential, but they're influential primarily because their interests in strangling the Cuban economy and overthrowing the revolution align with the long-standing U.S. imperial interest in suppressing alternatives to U.S. domination. The U.S. interest in dominating Cuba goes back far beyond 1959, much deeper. If you go back to the founding days of the U.S. as a republic, people like Jefferson are already talking about the need to acquire Cuba, or at least dominate Cuba, in the interest of, in the economic interest of the United States. In the case of Israel, the main book that I want to point you to is by a historian named Irene Genzier, called Dying to Forget. And she analyzes the U.S. government response to the foundation of Israel in 1948. And it's a really interesting book because it really challenges some of the assumptions that we see in mainstream discourse, including some leftist discourse, about the way that the Zionist lobby shapes U.S. policy. The Zionist lobby is important, and it's not just Jewish, it's Jewish and Christian. A lot of non-Jewish Zionists as well involved in this. But that lobby really only has power because, just like with Cuban Americans, their interests align with the imperial interest. What is that imperial interest in the case of Israel? It largely comes down to the need to control Middle East oil and the need to secure the other kinds of military and economic arrangements which are necessary to safeguard privileged U.S. and Western access to the Middle Eastern land. So if we look specifically at the late 1940s, if you look at 1947, what the U.S. government is saying in 1947 about the prospective formation of the State of Israel. This is right around the time of the UN partition resolution in late 1947. The U.S. government is actually very conflicted about this. They're very skeptical of the idea of creating an Israeli state. And they're skeptical because they're fearful about upsetting the status quo in the Middle East. They're fearful that this is going to create a massive refugee crisis, as it of course did. They're fearful that Arab states are going to retaliate by restricting U.S. access to oil and by rescinding the U.S. right to use military bases in their countries. And the U.S. government also recognizes the expansionist ambitions of Israeli leaders as a profound threat. And I'll give one or two quick quotes here. So the CIA in 1947, November of 1947, says, in the long run, this is confidential, of course, in the long run, no Zionists in Palestine will be satisfied with the territorial arrangements of the partition settlement, which is the UN resolution. Even the more conservative Zionists will hope to obtain the whole of the Negev desert, Western Galilee, the city of Jerusalem, and eventually all of Palestine. The Secretary of State in the United States, George Marshall, the one who presided over the Marshall Plan in Western Europe after World War II, he warned in 1948, if Jews follow counsel of their extremists who favor contemptuous policy toward Arabs, any Jewish state to be set up will be able to survive only with continuous assistance from abroad. He also privately criticized what he called the aggressive tendencies of the Israeli government. So even the U.S. government itself in 47 and 48 was recognizing Israeli expansionism as a threat to the region and even to the threat of Israeli society itself. And yet by 1949, the U.S. has resolutely decided to back the Israeli state because it recognizes that the Israeli military, in particular, can be a force operating to our advantage, in the words of the U.S. representative to the United Nations, Philip Jessup. And they also recognize specifically that the U.S. interest in securing Middle Eastern oil could be advanced by the U.S.-Israeli alliance. And Zionist leaders reached out to U.S. government officials and the State Department, Department of the Interior, and other parts of the U.S. government, courting their support based on this idea that Israel could be an effective junior partner of the United States. Israel also demonstrated its military capacity both in 1948 and especially in 1967, the Six-Day War. It demonstrated that it was militarily capable of suppressing Arab resistance. So after 1967, that's when the U.S.-Israel alliance really kicks into high gear. The U.S. had supported Israel before, but after 67, the military aid just goes to a new level. The U.S. in 1968 becomes the leading military supplier to Israel. By the mid-1970s, Israel is the leading recipient of U.S. military aid. Right. And this is all recognized in the high levels of the U.S. government as advantageous to U.S. capital and U.S. empire. I could give you more quotes, but I'll skip over those in the interest of time. But I will recommend one other piece that just came out a week or so ago by a scholar named Adam Hene. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the one with the H is called Framing Palestine. It's an article that was published recently. And he essentially updates that analysis. His argument is that the U.S. interest in supporting Israeli occupation and aggression comes down to not the role of Zionist lobbyists in the United States so much, but comes down to the U.S. interest in continuing to secure Middle Eastern oil. So I recommend that article. I think I'm actually going to stop there in the interest of time. I know that I went a little over, so I'm going to leave out my final 2 points and pass it over to Anna Claire.
Okay, Kevin, that was really rich. Sort of ask transparently, so we've had some folks ask about like taking notes and sharing notes about like for people who can't make it or who maybe missed part of the discussion. If you can talk later, you'd be willing to share your notes in a way that you can circulate after today. Oh, that was wonderful. And if someone could take a photo of these resources, that would be amazing.
I already have them.
Awesome. Also, I seem to have lost my phone, and I have kids, so if anybody sees a little black iPhone somewhere, hopefully my kids are okay. I am not a historian. I'm a faux historian. I do I guess literary criticism, and so here I am failing slightly. Anyway, I really love this Patrick Wolf article, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's really helpful for me as somebody who I don't do genocide studies. I write about settler colonialism loosely related to the texts I write about, which are about like Renaissance drama. But something I kind of want to like introduce from things that I have studied about the time period I look at is there is this notion in early modern England, and it is kind of a Western early modern idea of improvement, and it really has a bearing on how settler colonialism develops in this 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. And improvement it can have a bearing on like the way racialization works, like who is capable of improvement, which is white people or whiteness. Whiteness is something, one of the marks of whiteness, or the hallmarks of whiteness is the capacity to improve. And of course becomes the basis for who counts as civilized. The other thing is it has a bearing on the idea of who is entitled to or capable of improving the land. So we see this obviously with the way that propaganda works to like basically either claim that Palestinians just like kind of don't exist, or that they have no right to the land because they failed to cultivate it and make the desert bloom. So I just want to kind of throw in something I think it's sort of historically relevant to thinking about like what are the sort of philosophical undercurrents of some of what we're like talking about today. So Patrick Wolf considers the uneven manifestations of settler colonialism and the role of genocide in settler colonialisms. One of the major contributions of this text is this claim that settler colonizers come to stay, which means that invasion is a structure, not an event. This structure is continually reproduced, not relegated to the past, just like empire, and that's because it's a tool of empire, right? And settler colonialism is inherently eliminatory, but not invariably genocidal. For Wolf, there is the logic of elimination that undergirds all settler colonialism that also has these positive elements. When he says positive, he doesn't mean good, he means like additive. And that's kind of what ends up distinguishing between what constitutes settler colonialism being genocide or becoming genocidal versus being sort of propagated as this structure over time. So included in this sort of what counts as like additive or positive elements are things like whether the subjugated or indigenous population is deemed useful to the colonial project. either through like labor or culture or whatnot. Elimination refers to more than the summary liquidation of indigenous people, is logic of elimination. Though it does include that, in its positive aspect, the logic of elimination marks a return whereby the native repressed continues to structure settler colonial society. It is both as complex social formation and as continuity through time. And that's why he terms it as a structure rather than an event. My big takeaway from this article is that while genocide is held up or singled out as this like most spectacularly evil and violent possible thing that can happen, it's sort of has a special status as like violence or evil par excellence, and something which has often therefore been gatekept, right? You can think of the way that like the Holocaust with a capital H is sort of gatekept as a special event. Not that it's not unique, but it's like special. In fact, it was the Armenian genocide that was the original Holocaust, right? There are intense differences amongst genocide study scholars as to the definitions of genocide, but Wolff demonstrates that settler colonialism as a structure, not an event, is this ominous, violent thing as well, right? Its impulse is elimination, but it may not ultimately fit into the box of genocide as people define it, but this does not detract from its violence and very well factors into how it operates as an ongoing, eliminatory, violent, evil project. Sorry, I don't really like using the word evil, I'm just using it for emphasis, right? So, it's kind of important to understand the difference between settler colonialism and colonialism. I do feel like you kind of talked about it, maybe alluded to this in places or talked about it, but I could have missed that. But maybe this, settler colonialism is a form of colonization in which outsiders come to land inhabited by indigenous peoples and claim it as their own. That's sort of like this famous definition from Tuck and Yang, which means, of course, again, it's not an act of the past, it's something that just is ongoing as long as settlers are living on appropriated land. Settler colonialism destroys to replace. So he quotes Theodor Herzl, the founding father of Zionism. He observed in his own allegorical novel, if I wish to substitute a new building for an old one, I must demolish before I construct. On the symbolic level, settler society sometimes recuperates indigeneity in order to express its difference, and accordingly its independence from the mother country, as is the case with the US, as is the case with Australia. But he notes how I would say Israel does recuperate indigeneity in some ways, but ultimately things like, Israel does things like literally replaces Arabic place names with Hebrew place names. If you've ever read the novel Minor Detail, which is sort of like historical novel, there's kind of a lot in there about this sort of problem becoming disoriented by the fact that all of the place names are now in Hebrew, and therefore the native Palestinian is completely lost, right? So these are some of the, nuances between how settler colonialism operates that Wolff points out. Colonialism, on the other hand, has been defined as systems and practices that seek to impose the will of one people on another and to use the resources of the imposed people for the benefit of the imposer. So colonialism can operate within political, sociological, and cultural values and systems of a place even after occupation by colonizers has ended. Which is sort of, I think, an interesting definition if we think back to the Huey P. Newton intercommunalism piece that we read last week, where he talks about the sort of the fantasy of decolonization, right? If anyone remembers that, okay. He also talks a lot about how race is used as a tool of settler colonialism. He considers how the organizing grammar of race is employed in European settler colonialism, but how it is designed to achieve different ends, i.e. Being raised as indigenous, being raised as African or Black, do not have the same outcomes or effects, or nor are they intended to have the same outcomes or effects. And all of which is to benefit the colonial project. For example, of course, like blood quantum regulations, which are federally imposed Indian blood laws, define Native American status by fractions of Native American ancestry, And this can be kind of compared to or contrasted with like the one drop rule of blackness in America that illustrates that the reproduction of enslaved black people made their owners wealthy, whereas the reproduction or even existence of Native Americans obstructed settlers' access to land, right? So there's like sort of a positive, again, not good, positive as a, there's like this positive aspect of making the proliferation of blackness useful to the colonial project because it produces and reproduces free labor. Whereas, what is it? Kind of like shattering Native identity into little particles and having the federal government kind of control what particles get scattered where and what that means in terms of your identity and assimilation is a really powerful tool for basically removing, as whatever, I don't know, symbolically or whatever, but removing nativeness, right?
Yeah, sorry, because for some nations too, you have to have a certain level of blood quantum to be considered still part of. So like, right, those nations, if you are part of them, really have to think about if you want to have kids even, am I marrying someone within the tribe? Are my kids going to be part of this tribe? Do you have legal claim to your identity?
Yes, and so yeah, it's like, and so this has been a powerful tool for, in effect, trying to relegate Native identities to a thing of the past, right? But ultimately, race is a tool of settler colonialism, and the main objective of which is access to territory as its irreducible element, according to Wolff. And so I will note in the case of Israel that it's both, the two tools of Israel have been anti-Arab or anti-Palestinianness or whatever, and anti-Semitism. Right? Anti-Semitism both exploited as a kind of logic for Israel's existence, but also anti-Semitism in the sense that Israel continues to racialize Jews and nationalize them as always already potentially Israeli, right? Thereby digging into this idea that, that stems from Zionism's origins, which is that borrows from the idea that Jews are not welcome anywhere else. They need their own homeland, right? So I'll kind of end with this idea that, with his, he talks about these sort of uneven applications of race and racialism and racialization as tools of settler colonialism. So we cannot simply say that settler colonialism or genocide have been targeted at particular races, since a race cannot be taken as given. It is made in the targeting. Black people were racialized as slaves, and slavery constituted their blackness. Correspondingly, indigenous North Americans were not killed, driven away, romanticized, assimilated, fenced in, bred white, and otherwise eliminated as the original owners of the land, but as Indians. And I also think this has tremendous bearing on our discussions of Palestinianness as indigenous, right? He makes this distinction between victims murdered for where they are and victims murdered for who they are. So far as indigenous people are concerned, where they are is who they are. And as Deborah Bird-Rose points out, to get in the way of settler colonization, all the native has to do is stay at home. I'm really struck by, there's a current meme going around. I hate memes, but there's a meme going around that's all if to be a good Palestinian, you have to die. I mean, there's more to it than that, but have you seen this one? Okay, so there we go. That's my overview of Patrick Wolff, and I believe we also have discussion questions on the back of this.
Not yet.
Okay, that have not appeared yet. So there, yeah. Yes, and I'm sure everyone needs a short break, and then we maybe take questions and discussion, yeah.